Welcome in to another episode of my Dynasty Fantasy Football YouTube. Today, I'm looking at some Dynasty buys. Make sure to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe if you haven't. 60% of viewers aren't subscribed. Let's change that. And here's our first player. So, George Kittle. So, you would think for me, this is kind of odd. I usually don't like the older players. But George Kittle kind of has a rank that confuses me. He's dropped all the way down to tight end 10 on Keep Trade Cut. I have him at tight end 8. Why is Kittle behind Travis Kelce? 4 years older. Didn't look so great at the end of last year. I could see maybe why that one. But Kittle's also behind Jake Ferguson, who is fine, but Jake Ferguson is just a guy. I don't think he's actually all that great, and he could disappear in a year's time. So I just think that Kittle is a little bit undervalued considering what he's offered. And let's look at that. In 2018, his first year after his rookie year, that's his best season. 88 catches, 1,377 yards, 5 touchdowns, 136 targets, 5.6 catches, and 86.1 yards a game. He was great. Then, very similar in 2019, similar catches, less yards, the same 5 touchdowns, still 6.1 catches a game, which is excellent for a tight end. 75.2 yards a game. Again, excellent. Then in 2020, he didn't play very many games, but when he did play, he delivered very similar numbers to 2019, except still only 2 touchdowns. He never had a season with great touchdowns over the first 3 years. 2021 fell off a little bit, but still great. I mean, 5 catches and 65 yards a game for a tight end is really, really good. And then over the last 2 years, in 2022, he finally got the touchdowns to break through. 11 touchdowns as they went through 3 quarterbacks that year. The 49ers did. 4 catches and 51 yards a game. Started to see a little bit of a decline in catches and yards, but made up for it in touchdowns. And then last year, the yardage came back. 63.8 yards a game. Very, very solid for a tight end. Just 4.1 catches on 90 total targets, 65 catches, 1,020 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So he was still great. He was great again. He's always been good. So I get it. The 49ers drafted Ricky Pearsall, but both Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel are subject to trade rumors. My guess has always been that the 49ers extend Brandon Ayuk and move on from Deebo Samuel probably next year, but they're not going to be able to have all of these players long term. And I do think Kittle, you can find other wide receivers, but there's like 4 or 5 George Kittle types. There isn't someone else who can play that position, who can block and who can be as much of a receiving threat at tight end as George Kittle. That's a unicorn. That is very hard to find. And tight ends are not as expensive. So George Kittle, I see being here long term. Now, how to acquire George Kittle? A couple of ways. You could buy him for Travis Kelce, like I mentioned earlier, Jake Ferguson. I would easily rather have Kittle over those players. And then I did see a trade, George Kittle for the 204, Superflex tight end premium. I would gladly give up the 204 to get George Kittle. Guaranteed production, tight end premium. Seems like an easy move to make. So to close out on George Kittle, I just don't get his current cost. I get why you'd fade him a little bit. He turns 31 in September, but he's too low currently. Next up, Jalen Hurts. So Hurts is obviously very highly valued still. Keep Trade Cut has him quarterback 5. I have him quarterback 4. I believe Lamar Jackson is the player that's flipped. I have Lamar Jackson behind Jalen Hurts. Keep Trade Cut has Lamar Jackson ahead. But more interestingly, Hurts is behind Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, and Jamar Chase in Superflex. That sounds wrong to me, given their ages, quarterback scarcity, and quarterback longevity. Let's look at what Hurts has done. In 2021, first year as a starter, 61.3% completion, 16 touchdowns, 9 picks, 7.3 yards per attempt, and 139 carries, 784 yards, and 10 touchdowns. So if this is all he did, I would say as a passer, it's not good enough to last long term. But as a rusher, of course, he gives us fantasy value. But then the last 2 years, he stepped up. In 2022, he was really good. 66.5% completion. Solid. 22 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. Solid. 8 yards per attempt. That's very good. And 760 rushing yards and 13 touchdowns. Also very good. So is 2022 what we're going to get every year? Probably not. But let's look at 2023, his bad season. It was so bad. Still 65.4% completion. Still accurate. 23 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. That's a little high on the interceptions. I'd like to see that come down. 7.2 yards per attempt. It's solid. It's okay. Nothing special, but it's not bad. And then we had obviously 15 rushing touchdowns and just 605 yards. So the Eagles offense kind of sputtered down the stretch last year, and they did make some changes, brought a new offensive coordinator. And I think they're going to do a little bit better this year. I'm not sure we're going to go back to 2022, but I do think we're going to do better than we did at the end of 2023. So the Eagles locked up A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith on long-term deals, and they added Saquon Barkley at running back. So they're all locked up with offensive weapons around Jalen Hurts. So I'm very excited to see him this year. Now, couple of trades. Jalen Hurts, you could buy for Jordan Love and the 211. I would do this immediately. I like Jordan Love. Like, don't get me wrong. I think Jordan Love is a good quarterback, a franchise quarterback. Jordan Love was a franchise quarterback for 8 or 9 games, and he doesn't run like Jalen Hurts. So he's not as guaranteed on the long term actually being good and doesn't have the rushing upside. So I would easily pay the 211 to go from Love to Hurts. That's not hard for me. And then this one, I think is a little more interesting. I saw you could buy Jalen Hurts for Jahmyr Gibbs and 108. That's starting to get a little bit more on the expensive side, but I think I'd still have to lean the stud quarterback in Jalen Hurts in a super flex. I just don't think you're going to get the value back out of Jahmyr Gibbs in the 108 compared to Hurts. Now, to close out on Jalen Hurts, I think Hurts is still a stud level quarterback. The value says he's more in tier 1B instead of just tier 1, which is where I have it. And it's an opportunity to acquire shares of Hurts, maybe even more so in startups than in the trade market. Now, if you like my YouTube content, you should sign up for the Patreon. You get my rankings, access to the Discord, and the ability to ask in advance questions for the YouTube videos. Tiers begin at just $6 a month. And of course, I pride myself on being an independent voice on this channel where we're not controlled by corporate interests or editors or anything like that. So the independent support from the Patreon allows me to keep the channel going. So I just really appreciate everyone who contributes to that. And we also had a lot of fun doing roster reviews for patrons, and those are only available to patrons. So sign up right now and you can get in on that. Now, our final player, Xavier Worthy. So Worthy, I've noticed, has kind of lost some value since rookie drafts. He's all the way down to wide receiver 28 on Keep Trade Cut. I have him wide receiver 24. What's really changed since the rookie drafts? He dropped a pass in minicamp. Rashee Rice's legal issues aren't front page. Worthy's behind Brian Thomas and now just barely ahead of Ladd McConkey in rankings. Now, of course, Worthy doesn't have any NFL stats, but he was a great 3-year player at Texas. In 2021, 62 catches, 981 yards, 12 touchdowns. 2022, 60 catches, 760 yards, 9 touchdowns. And then last year, 75 catches, 1,014 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Current situation, obviously, Rashee Rice. I still think a suspension is coming. We know that they signed Hollywood Brown in free agency. And of course, Patrick Mahomes is there at quarterback to give Xavier Worthy both a high floor and a high ceiling from that type of quarterback production. But also, I do think people still cast Worthy aside as just a speed threat, whereas unlike all those other speed threats that they mentioned, your Henry Ruggs, your John Ross, Xavier Worthy actually has college production. So I think he's more ready to translate to the NFL than players like that. Now, some trade ideas. Could you buy Xavier Worthy for Ladd McConkey in a 25 third? McConkey, I know, is getting hype in camp, but I would still easily add a 25 third to McConkey for Xavier Worthy. Better situation. And additionally, Worthy is first round pick and a far, far superior prospect statistics-wise to Ladd McConkey. And then another one. I mentioned Tank Dell and Zay Flowers as sells on the channel at times. Could you get Xavier Worthy and a 25-second in exchange for one of those players? I would do that. I like Worthy maybe even more than those guys long-term. But even if you're giving up a little bit of production right now, you can get a 25-second back with Worthy. Now, to close out on Xavier Worthy, I think Worthy is a great college prospect. He's just 21 years old and a great offense with great draft capital, but his value continues to drop. I disagree with that. So I am buying in on Xavier Worthy. Now, I have some questions from the Patreon. And remember that only patrons get to ask these in advance questions. So sign up for the Patreon to get your question read on the next show. How has your perspective on Christian Watson changed? Is there more than his hamstrings? Well, I mean, his hamstrings are a part of it for sure. I mean, seeing now a second year where you just can't stay on the field and more injuries, and it's a chronic injury too. We're still talking about the hamstring. We're still talking about hamstring injuries. It's not he had an injury and he's healthy now. We're still talking about the hamstring. So that's why it's separate from some of the other injury-prone players. This is like seeming to be a chronic issue. So yes, there's that. But my other issue with Watson is, and the main thing is that he just didn't evolve in year 2. In year 1, as a 23-year-old rookie, in 14 games, he had 41 catches, 611 yards, 7 touchdowns on 66 targets. And he also added 80 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground, 2.9 catches and 43.6 yards a game. Then last year, he had 28 catches on 53 targets, not great, despite being with Jordan Love. 422 yards and 5 touchdowns, and no rushing touchdowns, just 11 yards on the ground, 3.1 catches and 46.9 yards a game. He didn't progress. That was the thing. He didn't progress. I liked the efficiency we saw year 1 as a 23-year-old rookie, second-round player, big play threat. We saw that year 1. What I would like to see then in year 2 is someone progress from being just a big play threat, just a, that kind of situational receiver, to a real alpha wide receiver, earn more volume. That did not happen. The volume did not increase in year 2. Watson turned 25 in May. We're not talking about a player who's just 23, who might still be growing. I think we know the type of player Watson is. I don't think he's going to become a different player in year 3. We saw that they were just as good throwing to Jayden Reed and Dontavian Wicks as alternatives. So for me, I don't think Christian Watson is going to be either a fantasy wide receiver 1 or like the true alpha wide receiver of the Packers. I thought that going into year 2. I no longer think that going into year 3. That doesn't seem possible. To me, the best case scenario for Watson is that he's first among a lot of guys, like a first among equals kind of thing. He'd be their nominal wide receiver 1, potentially, but not miles ahead of everyone else. Just the first among a close group. So his ceiling for me is more in the wide receiver, if everything goes right, in the wide receiver 20 to 25 range, not as a wide receiver 1 like I thought was possible last year. For me, I still think Jayden Reed is going to be the most productive wide receiver on the Packers. I have it close with him and Christian Watson. Reed, I think, is a lot safer. But yeah, I have Watson in redraft like in the 40s. So yeah, a lot of things changed my perspective. But mostly just kind of seeing Dontavian Wicks and Jayden Reed also be good and not really being impressed by Watson compared to them. Now, any OTA news you're taking negative or positive, you're taking seriously? Couple things. Isaac Guerrero has not been ready. He is dropping in my dynasty ranks. I think he's someone who's going to sit on the bench. I don't even know if he's the RB3. I'm hoping, but I'm nervous for him. Roman Wilson has been kind of quiet. Not sure what that means, but certainly hasn't done anything to move up my ranks. Braylon Allen has been dominating. He locked down the RB2 role for the Jets. That's pretty clear. And I moved him up because he's still just 20 years old. I think he's a very talented player. I'm not just going to fade someone that I think is very good and we know is very young just because he got stuck behind Breece Hall. Jermaine Burton, I think, is the real deal. We're hearing a lot of hype about Jermaine Burton. So he's definitely someone who's been moving up in my ranks. And then lastly, Pop Douglas on the Patriots. I think he's going to be their wide receiver 1 probably this year. He's definitely not Javon Baker. That much I can tell you. To me, it seems like Douglas and Jalen Polk are 1 and 2. And I think wide receiver 1 will be Kendrick Bourne. 3. Wide receiver 3 will be Kendrick Bourne if they're healthy. So I think that their intended starters are Douglas, Bourne, and Polk. But we'll see. But Douglas has been looking really good. So that's something I'm taking seriously. Now, if you like the video, make sure to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. As always, the best way to support the channel is to subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notifications bell so you can be notified about all my exciting content as it drops. Of course, if you want my best fantasy football advice, it's available on the Patreon. Dynasty Redraft, Rookie, Start Sit, and more. And every sign-up helps support my independent content. But once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later.